you so very much for coming to tonight's presentation. I'm Margaret Tamilonis, the chair of the Center for the Research on Vermont's Executive Committee. I also work at the Fleming Museum here at UVM. Richard Watts is the director of the Center for Research on Vermont, and I want to just point him out here and thank him so much for all of the work he has been doing for the center. It's been wonderful. I'd also like to recognize Antonio Cepeda Bonita, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and Governor Jim Douglas for joining us as well. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. The center has had a busy year, and I want to briefly mention a few initiatives before introducing tonight's program, and I promise I'll be brief. The first item to mention is an increased emphasis on the use of electronic technologies to meet our mission to promote and celebrate Vermont research. I would strongly recommend that you look at our website. Can I pull it up here? Okay. Well, do visit the Center for Research on Vermont's website. On the center's webpage, you'll find links to short videos with prominent Vermont researchers, our twice-monthly blog postings on Vermont research news, and a list of upcoming center awards and activities. Also, I'd really recommend, if you haven't already, that you join our mailing list, and Richard has a clipboard. He can take your name down and get you onto the mailing list, so please do that to keep up on Vermont and Vermont research news. Most recently, the Center for Digital Initiatives at the Bailey Howe Library has started digitizing the large collection of past center publications, which are just an incredible resource that's been going on for decades. And a link to that will soon be on our website, so please do check that as well. Now let's turn to tonight's excellent program, about which I am incredibly excited and feel very, very privileged to get to introduce the speakers here tonight. Tonight's presenters include Kevin Graffinino, Nicholas Muller, and David Donath, and former longtime center coordinator Kristen Peterson-Ishak. Tonight's presentation will discuss their new book, The Vermont Difference: Perspectives from the Green Mountain State, featuring 18 essays on areas: historic preservation, sustainable agriculture, state and local history, underwater archaeology, that's kind of my favorite part, the creative economy, women in public leadership, small d democracy, and respect for the environment, in which Vermont's record merits national attention. And that's been an ongoing theme here at the Center for Research on Vermont. And let me just give you I know many of you know the people speaking tonight, but let me give you a brief bio on each of them. Kevin Graffinino is director of the William I. Clements Library at the University of Michigan and a prolific Vermont researcher. His many books include Vermont Voices, 1609 through the 1990s, a documentary history of the Green Mountain State with Samuel B. Hand, Gene Sessions, and The Shaping of Vermont, From the Wilderness to the Centennial, 1749 to 1877. He's the author of dozens of papers and books on Vermont and a longtime member of the Center for Research on Vermont. David Donath is the president of the Woodstock Foundation, which operates the Billings Farm and Museum, an operating dairy farm dedicated to telling the story of Vermont's rural heritage. David has also written and published extensively on Vermont, including the book, A Simpler Time: A Lie Accepted as Truth is More Powerful Than the Lie. Nick Muller is a co-founder of the Center for Research on Vermont, a former dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UVM, president of Colby Sawyer College for 12 years, and former president of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and also a prolific author and Vermont scholar with a number of publications, including In a State of Nature, Readings in Vermont History with Sam Hand. Kristen Peterson-Ishak was the coordinator of the center for more than 30 years. During that time, she contributed to many scholarly Vermont research activities, including The Essential Aiken, A Life in Public Service by Steve Terry and Sam Hand, and she is now the co-editor of The Vermont Difference. We are also very pleased to welcome Kristen as the newest member of the Center's Executive Committee. Please join me. Please join me in welcoming the editors of The Vermont Difference.
Thank you, Margaret. For those of you who don't know, I'm the one called Kevin. I'm I'm starting with this image as proof that 3 of the 4 editors of this project started working together some 40 years ago. This picture was taken on the porch of the pavilion in Montpelier just after David and I had finished our first ever public presentations, which we regard with horror today as utterly dismal appearances. Nick had made us do them as our professor. I was 21, I think David was 22, I think Nick was 23 at the time. And we did not get off to a roaring start, David and I, as public speakers. I hope we are better now. For this much happier project, we and Chris Peterson-Isaac wanted to compile a book that tells Americans about the lessons that Vermont has to impart. We knew at the outset that we would have some preconceived outside notions to overcome. After all, for many Americans, the popular perception of Vermont begins and ends with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. After that, Americans who think about Vermont at all probably struggle to come up with any names other than Ben and Jerry as other Vermonters. For instance, Justin Smith Morrill, shown here, principal architect of the Land-Grant College Act that transformed American higher education, is not a national household name, to say the least. Or Calvin Coolidge, as one of the 2 American presidents born in Vermont. You're not going to win on Jeopardy if you're not from Vermont, answering a question about Calvin Coolidge. Or Ralph Flanders, the principal author of the U.S. Senate resolution that censured Joe McCarthy. I know he's not really all that important, but this is my favorite picture of a Vermont politician. What those guys will do to get votes. To Americans, of course, Vermont is also the land of idiosyncratic, laconic yup and nope natives, epitomized by Larry, Darrell, and Darrell on the Newhart Show for 8 years. And of course, to most Americans, Vermont really means scenery, clean air, a lovely place to own a summer home, et cetera, et cetera. This project began in 2007. I was asked as director of the Vermont Historical Society to give a Vermont 101 talk to 125 American college and university presidents who were meeting in Stowe that summer. And I went, I gave my talk, I talked to them about history, about tradition, they asked for things we could take back to our campuses that Vermont imparts, that lessons Vermont has to instill. I did. I hope I did a pretty good job in 45 minutes. They seemed happy. I was happy. Driving home, I began to think there's something more in this than a 45-minute talk, that Vermont really does have something to say to the rest of America, whether it is leadership in small-town democracy, government ethics, women in leadership roles, for instance, historic preservation, underwater archaeology, support for libraries, literacy, and the arts, concern for our state and local history, heritage tourism, outdoor recreation, the environment, pervasive sense of the Vermont brand, higher education service to Vermont and Vermonters. Here you have longtime UVM President Guy Bailey, who really pioneered service to Vermont as a principal goal of this university, and as carried on today at the Center for Research on Vermont. This is something Vermont is distinctive in. You don't see this in most other states. Sustainable agriculture, land stewardship, and all of those things, those realizations got Nick Muller and me thinking in 2007, 2008, drafting a list of topics that we thought essays might cover about Vermont, looking for authors who might write them. We were very confident that we'd have this book out by the end of 2009, because we know everything, it wouldn't be a piece of cake. And then life intervened. I moved to Michigan, the project languished. We resurrected it together long distance in 2010, enlisted David Donath as third editor, reuniting our 1976 trio, and bringing the Woodstock Foundation in as a co-publisher. Shortly after that, we signed Chris Peterson-Ishak up as first project manager and then as fourth editor. Chris has refused to come to the microphone with us. If she did, she could regale you with tales of trying to keep the three old geezers on track, in which she learned the true meaning of the word aggravation. I do want to point out, though, is that all of you can see, Nick, David, and I have not changed one bit from that 1976 photo. Chris, of course, was in kindergarten when that first picture was taken, so we have no point of comparison. One of the really gratifying things about this project was that virtually everybody we asked to write an essay for a tiny honorarium immediately said yes. People who were experts in their fields, who were distinguished Vermonters, said, we want to be part of this project. This is something we'd be proud to participate in. We know that we have a lineup in the book of 3 ex-governors and the current governor writing a foreword. We know that's unique in Vermont publishing history. We think the rest of the roster is as good as has ever contributed to a Vermont publishing project. So for the past 3 or 4 years, the 4 of us have worked with our authors, assemble a series of essays on what Vermont does well. With our texts in hand by last summer, we got very, very lucky when we signed Brian Prendergast on as book designer. Without Brian, we'd have had a university press book. Well-deserved applause. We would have had a book with a bank of black and white photos in the middle and lots of text. And with Brian, we have one of the best-looking Vermont books I've ever seen. And I am really, really grateful to him for that. And so here we are, 7 long years from idea to publication with what we hope is the kind of book that Vermonters will regard with pride, that will give people from away a new and more profound appreciation for our state, and that we hope that future generations will point to and say, if you want to know what Vermont was like, what it meant to be a Vermonter in the early decades of the 21st century, you need to look at the Vermont difference. Thank you.
I'm the 23-year-old called Nick. Let's see if I can make this thing work. I'd like to divert a little bit from where I thought I might go and ask these members and guests of the Center for Research on Vermont, how many of you were born in the state? Would you just raise your hand? It's a distinct minority. Of the 21 contributors to the book, including the editors and the people who contributed the essays, exactly 3 were born in the state of Vermont. And I found that, as I did the bios, I found that a really striking thing. I didn't find it negative at all. I found it meant a couple of things: that Vermont welcomed people, gave them some room to stretch, and by God, they stayed and they learned to love this place and to provide leadership for the state. When we set about to do this, we decided that we would ask our essayists to speak in their own voices. We did a little manipulation to try to make their voices harmonize, but not much. And they have. And I think when you get through the book and read it, you'll discover it's not only the beautiful book that Kevin talked about, but it's also substantive. And because it's in essays, you can read it a bit at a time. It doesn't have to be a cover-to-cover experience. When you read it, I think you'll find that this may be one of the small number of books that could sit here, maybe, that help define the state and its residents. You'll know more about what a Vermonter is and what Vermont is in reading this book. And there are not many tomes in the history of the state that would do that for you. I can think of Walter Hart's work, Dorothy Canfield Thompson's work, possibly even Ira Allen, the founder of this institution. You will also see that certain themes run through these essays. I probably should have punched up two things here, but one is the importance of the setting. Virtually every one of these essays gets something about the setting, whether it's the settlements, the lakes and wetlands, the mountains, the recreation on the lakes, the economy, literature. There's something about the land that has affected the state and its residents in how it behaves and thinks and acts. There's also something about smallness. I've got a thing of parade of 4 S's here: sight and smallness. And you can read about the town meetings in Frank Bryant's book. The smallness of the State House. Most other states have a place where all the legislators have an office and a staff. It's not the case in this building. It's really open to the people. It's transparent, by and large. The smallness, the community, we've seen that one. The economy, a small cheese manufacturer. It's transparent. You know what's going on in this state. There's very little that's kept under the covers. And the small d, democracy. It is in the arts and the literature. Vermont had the first state symphony orchestra, well ahead of any other state. Vermont had the first Council on the Arts 2 years before the National Endowment for the Arts. This building, not this building, this campus, had a Burlington native, John Dewey, graduate in 1875, whose thinking was probably the most profound educational thinking in the history of the United States. Vermont excels on more of the arts, as the bread and puppet. Vermont excels in stewardship. This is George Perkins Marsh. He once said some pretty awful things about the flatlands of Iowa and Wisconsin, and talked about Vermonters who went there as, leaving the state, and there was something wrong with them. They didn't have the guts to stand up. Of course, he left the state and went to Italy. But his book is the Bible of the environmentalists. Here's Dean Davis signing Act 250, another monumental achievement in stewardship. The stewardship of the land, the community-supported agriculture. Our heritage, the Virgins Opera House, beautiful job there, combining the arts, the humanities, and programs with a historic preservation project. The Brandon Baptist Church, you can read about Brandon in the book. Paul Brune starts his article on historic preservation, where Vermont's clearly the national leader at the beginning. It led. And the work in Brandon, where Stephen Douglas also grew up in the shadow of this church. And I think Mr. Donath is going to mention something about Mr. Douglas, so I won't. We usually don't get along this well. There's never any tension. It's just that I would love to steal that little nugget from him, but I won't. Here's Ed Koren. Does anybody recognize the cartoonist for the New Yorker, who was the leader in the Brookfield Old Town Hall restoration? And the historic preservation where smallness is important, and the stewardship. Somehow in Bennington we got Walmart to go downtown, unlike what's going to go on in St. Albans. And the Vermont History Center, many ways the center of the preservation of the state's heritage. Preservation of its heritage in moving the Ticonderoga to the Shelburne Museum, a project of Ralph Nading Hill, who's also written some things you might turn to learn about Vermont and the state. Billings Farm and Museum. Mr. Donath can tell you more about that, but again, the respect for the heritage of the state. Art Cohn, an author, is here with us tonight. This was a project that he dreamed of, oversaw, and now will travel again this summer on a War of 1812 tour of Lake Champlain. The education of Royce Pitkin and ideas. He was a Deweyite, if you will. And we come back to Justin Smith Morrill. Dewey. And the fourth one of my S's is the fair sex. Madeline Cunan's piece on women in Vermont. Consuelo Northwip Bailey, first female lieutenant governor ever. First female attorney general. Secretary to the Republican Party. At my age, and many of you, we grew up hearing her at the Republican National Convention saying, Alabama cast 14 votes. And she'd go through the roll call. She lived up on Spear Street. But one of my favorites, Sister Elizabeth Camden, president of Trinity College, from Rutland, a member of the order, became Dick Snelling's Secretary of Health and Social Services here in Vermont, and got a lot of trouble because she had to get mixed up in the abortion issue. One of the people who really worked on Women's Place, Annette Parmalee, you can read about her in the book. The adult literacy, the attention to that. So the substance of the book and the authors of the essays have themes. The importance of the size and the site. The importance of the stewardship of the site. And the importance of individuals, and I chose tonight to recognize the females. David, my friend.
True fact. I stole the nugget from Nick that he gave back to me, so it's fair play. But I will, after I get my spectacles on, I'm going to take a different tack a little bit. For me, this is a very personal story. Obviously, it begins at a very important moment in my life and career about that photograph on the porch of the pavilion in July or August of '76 was literally 2 weeks before I blew out of here and headed for the Midwest and to launch a career and pursue studies at the University of Wisconsin. I'm not a native, but I'm an oldie I'm an old Burlington kid. My folks moved here when I was 13 years old. And so I think about Stephen Douglas's comment that Nick begins the introduction with, that Vermont is a great place to be from. I can just see the little tyrant saying those words. Great place to be from, provided you get out of here soon enough. And I've had the pleasure in my career to be both from here and to come here. Come here twice. Come here to stay the second time. When I came here when I was 13 years old, Burlington was a very, very different place. Chittenden County was a very, very different place than what it is today or the way it feels today. I grew up on the north end of Burlington. My pals included kids who lived literally in shanties on at the mouth of the Winooski. We referred to them as French Canadians. They referred to themselves as river rats. And we hung out together and we went fishing together and did all kinds of stuff together. And I only now know they were a remnant of the Abnaki community that lived in the inner vale of the Winooski River until only 20, 30, 40 years ago. Their shantytown is now $100,000 or $250,000 condos overlooking the lake. I grew up when I was in high school. I did odd jobs on Church Street. Got all over, up and down Church Street at a time when Church Street was, first of all, there was traffic on Church Street. I'll come back to that. And second of all, most of the stores, with the exception of Woolworths and Penny's, were locally owned businesses. Now, through heroic preservation efforts, we've preserved Church Street, but only at the expense of chaining it and mauling it. When I was a kid, we used to, in high school, we cruised Church Street in our beat-up old cars, our parents' cars, hoping that, one of those times we'd stop at a red light up by the church and there would be a carload of 4 girls who were willing to kind of cruise with us for a while and go out Shelburne Road to the Lure. Anybody here in the room remember the Lure? Right now, I noticed that the Burger King is gone. The Lure was displaced by McDonald's, and then that was displaced by Burger King, and now it's just a greasy spot on Williston Road. And around the time that I came to the University of Vermont, I began to discover that Vermont also was a famous destination. That was the time of Expo 67. It was the time of the beckoning country. We saw that. Or Vermont, which then morphed into Vermont, a special world. When I was in the band at Burlington High School, we went up to Expo at least 5 or 6 times to play concerts and realized that this was some place that people cared about. And Vermont was really growing far more than I thought it ever would or believed it would at that time. I also took a job working on the ferry boats on Lake Champlain, which gave me a perspective on the state as a place that was a destination that people were trying to get to because it was beautiful. And it was a place that was depicted on postcards, and people, came and we, by God, we were famous. We high school kids out there, the Vermont Navy, signing autographs for 15-year-old young ladies on their last summer vacation with mom and dad and stuff. But that gave me a perspective on Vermont that this was a place to come to. So right after graduating from UVM, I went away. Going away is something that many of my colleagues and classmates did after graduation. I did it after I got my master's because away was where opportunity was. And I was very taken a week ago when I learned about the study that was mentioned earlier over dinner, that why we stay in Vermont and why we don't. Some very important material here and some stuff that really resonated with me about, especially when I read the blog part about people telling their own stories about why they came, why they went away, why they went, some of them sort of back and forth and back and forth. Suffice it to say, I was away for a decade, and it was a crucial decade. It was the decade of the late 70s and 76 to 85. And during that time, Vermont was transformed. When I got back to Vermont, Vermont was really worried about growth. We had a governor's commission on growth at that time. The sleepy place whose population had hardly changed since the Civil War was now booming and desirable, and the beckoning country had given way to a special world, meaning we didn't want to beckon all that much because we were experiencing too much of what the beckoning brought. Burlington had changed greatly. It had become a trendy, progressive place, a wonderful place, but very different from the small city that I had grown up in. And the rest of Vermont, I came back to Woodstock on the other side of the mountains, and very much a haven for both cultural tourists and rusticating flatlanders, people who came and lived and stayed, or came and visited, or came seasonally, which is, and also a population now that was aging with declining school enrollments and questions about its future. It's a place where where the graduating class of Woodstock High School was going to be able to get a job. In the last 10 years, one of the things, I'll digress a moment, one of the things we struggled with in this book was there's a fine line. Where's Greg Sanford? Is he in there? He left. Good thing. Greg and I were here together when I did my master's. We struggled with a question of Vermont's distinctiveness and not wanting to tout Vermont as exceptional, a place laden with too much exceptionalism, knowing that, well, as historians, you raise your head with words like exceptional or biggest, oldest, greatest, tallest, whatever. You're liable to get it blown off. But I do talk about Vermont as a distinctive place, and I think you've heard from Nick and from Kevin and seen and know from your own experiences that there is a distinctiveness of place, that beautiful landscape that is the lure, if you will, and also a distinctiveness of culture. And the distinctiveness of culture in particular is explored in 18 different ways in this book. And the two combine to create something that Vermonters didn't think this up, but has been laid on us, what I will boldly call a world-class destination. And that's not exceptionalist, that's verges on the triumphalist, which I know is a disastrous thing to do as a historian. But Vermont is indeed a world-class destination. And it was, we know that this is, when National Geographic designated Vermont as one of the top 5 or 10 among the 125 best places, best unspoiled places on the planet, most Vermonters said, "You got to be kidding." I mean, it's not something we would have thought up. It's not anything we applied for. But it was something that people who judge places and distinctive places of culture judged us to be. We scored higher than any other place in the United States. We were in company with the Norwegian fjords, Cape Breton, New Zealand's South Island, otherwise known as Middle Earth, the Canadian Rockies, Quebec City, and Slovenia. And if you haven't been to Slovenia, you've got to go there. It's the one that's the nearest to Vermont that I can see in that list. And we were scored highly twice, in 2005, and then again when National Geographic did the same study in 2009. We also happened to have been placed on the National Trust for Historic Preservation's endangered list at the same time, which I think is part of the dilemma that we all face, that we all struggle with, the dilemma of growth, the dilemma of transforming, evolving Vermont, and how we sustain those things that make this place what it is and why we want to be here. When National Geographic evaluated places, These were the criteria, and these criteria resonate, I think, with many of the essays that are in the book. Environmental quality, social and cultural integrity, the condition of historic places and landscapes, the aesthetic appeal, the quality of tourism management, and the outlook for the future, that is sustainability, the likelihood that Vermonters could somehow keep it all together. And again, as I say, our authors within the book speak of many of these dimensions and drill down into how we got to be and how we do what we do the way we do it. So I say we are not exceptional, perhaps, but we certainly are distinctive. And we certainly have a place and a culture that is worth protecting. I was asked to make some comments about how come, I mean, I'm the third and least scholarly of the three amigos to come on board with this project. And why would the Woodstock Foundation care about this book? And why would we take this on as a project? And first of all, we didn't take it on alone as a project. We took it on jointly as a project with the Vermont Historical Society. We wanted and needed the depth of heritage roots that Vermont Historical Society represented, and quite frankly and quite selfishly, the Woodstock Foundation very much wanted to be seen to be affiliated with the Vermont Historical Society, and we're delighted and grateful that the Historical Society is a partner in this project. But why did the Woodstock Foundation take this on? Vermont Historical Society is all about history and Vermont's history and heritage, and that's something we're interested in at Billings Farm, certainly, along with agriculture, along with conservation, along with lots of other things. Woodstock Foundation is mostly about sustaining and enhancing Vermont as a world-class, I'm going to say, home place and destination. Those of us who've chosen to live here and hope to spend the rest of our years here know what I mean by a world-class home place. It's the place we choose. And those who'd like to be here or come here to look at Vermont and dream about the time that they might come to Vermont certainly see us in a world-class context. Woodstock Foundation's mission is about conservation and historic preservation, sustainable land use, and I will particularly direct that towards the working landscape, that combination of agricultural landscape and forest that is working, that is populated by small towns, villages, and the kind of small d democracy culture that is characteristic and such a healthy element in our society. And finally, we're about heritage, culture, and community. These are the things that the Woodstock Foundation cares about. And we believe that when you find a place, or if you can cultivate a place where these things are in balance and work together, you found a place that can lift the human spirit. And I don't know about you, but for me, Vermont is a place, the only place I've lived, or the place by far that lifts my spirit to be here and to be a part of. So reflecting back a little bit on Stephen Douglas, I think Vermont is that home place that lifts and sustains our spirits. Sometimes it nurtures us to launch us off to other places, as it did launch Stephen Douglas. Sometimes it urges us to return home, certainly something I felt those years that I was out in the Midwest. And sometimes it lures us here from other places to adopt and make our home, which probably applies to most everybody in this room, with the exception of the few hands that could say they were natives. Vermont's a great place to be from. Stephen Douglas was right. A great place to be from, either from back when or from today. Thank you very much.
These are my students, so I get to grab the microphone here. We've got a number of our essayists here. Would you stand, please? I'm going to move from... I was going to recognize you as individuals, but you know, it's really good. Yeah, but nobody recognizes Jim and Jan Alberts. No, they're a fantastic group, and I hope you take the time to look at this book, and I hope you take the time to read it. And I think my two colleagues would join me here, and Chris, if she wishes to. If you've got any questions that you'd like us to address, fine. I will begin that as they come here. And I don't know if Kevin was there then, but in my Wisconsin days, Archibald Cox was a Vermonter. And he was the one that refused to play ball with Nixon. And we had him in Wisconsin. He gave a very nice talk, but he couldn't hear. And so after I introduced him, and I waited until after he was finished, and I told the audience that there was a judge in northern Wisconsin, and Wisconsin elects its judges. And he was very much involved in the political scene, but he got too involved, and he was coming home almost every night with too much beer or brandy in him, in trouble. And finally his wife, with a roller pin, said, "The next time you come here drunk, I'm leaving." So he went on the wagon for about 10 days. And one night he got too much in him, and he came in and reached for the light switch and hit the pots and pans. Clatter, noise, he fell down, and the light went on with all the hair curlers and the rolling pin. "What do you have to say for yourself?" she yelled at him. "Madam, I will take questions from the floor." Are there any questions from the floor, or have you seen enough?
When do we start the next project?
Oh, Lord.
This is Brian Prendergast, who did the design of the book. Think about this. The book was printed in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He found the printer, an art book printer, and that helps explain the quality of the paper and the quality of the print job. And as I understand it, they printed that X number of thousands of books in 20 hours?
The presser was about 20 hours, yes.
Unbelievable. He asked a question, but I don't have the answer when the next book is. It'll be 7 years from now, at least.
Nick's next book comes out next month on Ethan Allen. He's too modest to say so.
With John Duffy, who's there.
Yes.
John, wave a hand.
A question we can answer.
Well, in that case, I think we should
we're done.
let Richard come up and do what he wants.
All right.
I think we should ask you guys a few questions, or anybody here.
We're okay.
Can you say anything about where you're going next with the book, if people are interested, or what? You're going all around Vermont for the next week.
We go to the Pavilion Building in Montpelier at noon tomorrow, then down to the Northshire Bookstore in Manchester for a book signing at 6 o'clock tomorrow. And we have a 4 o'clock reception at Billings Farm in Woodstock on Saturday.
Kevin will appear, since he'll be too modest, on the Mark Johnson show tomorrow with Art Cohn. I think Art was here tonight, but I don't think
Art's there.
Oh, there he is.
Yep.
With Art Cohn, the late director and inventor of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum now. He's a, what's your title there now?
60 Minutes is coming up soon, cover of Time and National Geographic. Movie rights are in negotiation. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Frank?
One of the authors, I could suggest one error that you made tonight, or it may not be an error, but on your percentage of people that were born in Vermont. What about a guy like me who was conceived in Vermont?
Well, you don't qualify, Brian. Sit down.
Frank's comment on this, and I don't think I put it in the bio section. Unhappily, I guess, his mother took him across the Connecticut River to the hospital at Colebrook, New Hampshire. But Frank claims that his 4 days in New Hampshire, he mostly had his eyes closed.
Chris, could you sign it? If you were to imagine gathering authors for this book again, for a sequel to this book in 20 or 30 years, what do you imagine some things might be that you see just now emerging?
David has something to say about that.
Yeah.
Well, it could be an essay on the first single-payer medical system in the country, or it could be that it cratered. I don't know.
One thing I think that that rings through this book, as it rings through has rung through the history of Vermont, up until that watershed I talked about in the 60s and 70s when there was the great influx began, is, you know, Vermont's was pretty much a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant plus French Roman Catholic place,
Irish.
and Irish, that also never really acknowledged that it had a Native American presence. And so I think that those voices are voices that are now coming together and will have a lot to say in the next 20 or 30 years.
You guys are going to sign copies of the book, yes?
Oh, sure.
Where?
$20, right back of the room. Nick does it for 10. How many of you folks have some connection with the university? We had 21 authors, I think 17 of them studied here, taught here, worked here, or some combination of the three. This is very substantially a University of Vermont product. And I have been beating a drum at this university and elsewhere for 30 years to get the university to do more about the Center for Research on Vermont. I hope this book will help that effort. We have the tradition of Guy Bailey, we have the tradition of the Gang of Six. We have led in this state at this university for more than a century in service to Vermont, work on Vermont topics, etc. It's a very proud heritage. And any of you who win the lottery, Howard Lincoln is going to come see you and say, your $10 million gift will endow the Center for Research on Vermont. It is time to do this, and somebody in this state needs to step up and make it happen. Put it back in Billings where it belongs with special collections, in one of the most beautiful buildings in this state. And I've been waiting for decades for this to happen. And somebody has got to help it come to fruition.
Built by the resident of a man who lives next to David's museum.
Exactly.
There's a nice piece in Tom Salmon's essay on higher education in Vermont and its national impact on Guy Bailey and what he did at the University of Vermont between 1920 and 1940. Bailey was also the last president of the university to be born in the state of Vermont. There have only been 3 over the years, but he was the last of them. I always thought Lyman Rowell was, but he turns out he's a renegade from New Hampshire.
Gio.
I'm Giovanna Keebles, state archaeologist, and I haven't read the book. I glanced at it. And one of the things that I was so happy, David, to hear you say is bring up the native voices. Because, acknowledging I haven't read the book, it would, to me, my 38 years as state archaeologist, there is the most powerful native thread in all of our history. And it's a very subtle thread, but it's really influenced certainly the early settlement, snowshoeing, sugaring. It's influenced our culture in a really subtle way. And those original Vermonters, meaning the people who were born in Vermont and are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were deeply influenced by the Abenaki neighbors. And so I just want to say that this is a book about our European history, and the native peoples have a very powerful voice. And the more we know, the more we know that. So I'm just speaking for the native
I think by and large, Gio, you're correct, although this book is not without some nod to the native people. For example, Ellen McCullough begins her essay on the arts in Vermont with the Colchester jar, which is an 8,000-year-old beautiful artifact.
400-year-old.
Only 400?
It's very old.
It's very old. Nevertheless, she does begin the essay with that, and with the statement that where there are people, there is a creative urge. And there's some other. By and large, though, I agree with you.
So that might be another book that we should think about as David's.
When I made the comment, I was also thinking about populations, recent arrival populations, East Asian population in Burlington. There was a wonderful, actually it was Vermont Public Television series on the Jewish neighborhood just down the hill from here. There's a very rich series of stories that need to be teased out. And Vermont has. I remember when Howard Dean was twitted for having a lily white bunch of campaign workers, and what he would have liked to have said is there weren't that many people to pull from, but that's not true anymore, and it may not have been true then.
I like this. We're getting comments from the floor as opposed to questions. That's better.
I like that we haven't yet gotten any short speeches disguised as questions.
We're not in Congress. Well, I guess I would.
And I would just end by saying that Mark Hudson of the Vermont Historical Society has books for sale here, I believe, in the back. I believe you, the three gentlemen and Kristen, are willing to stick around and sign. And
Absolutely.
so let's give a big thank you.
Before we finish clapping, there's somebody I'd also like to acknowledge who's standing down at the end of the row, and she's now backing away discreetly. Darlene Franzen is the other half of the team. She's the vice president of the Woodstock Foundation, and she is the organizing force behind the brilliance of the design of this publication. And she and Brian quite literally hold forth. So you can find them once or twice a month in the back room of the McDonald's at the interchange in Randolph with supersized iced tea, which they go back and refill for free, and designing things for the Woodstock Foundation. And anyway, she deserves a tremendous amount of credit.
Richard, thank you as we close. Thank you very much for inviting us and for paying this attention to the Vermont difference. I hope this difference makes a difference for the Center for Research on Vermont.